my fourth DFIR summit. It is the third time that I've stood on the stage and spoke to people. So you're saying to yourself, Shelley, why on earth would you be terrified? You've done this a few times before. Because, like The Simpsons' Troy McClure, you may recognize me from talks like 10 Ways to Rock Your Sock and Rising from the Ashes, How to Rebuild Your Security Program Gone Wrong with a little help from Taylor Swift. But those were people and process talks, and maybe a little bit about the technology that you use while you're doing those processes. I'm Canadian, so I say process, by the way. I will not say a boot at any time in this presentation. But I've never given what I would consider a really technical talk, something that sort of bared my soul a little bit about how technical or how not so technical I am compared to other folks in the room. Additionally, I have been challenging myself to learn to code better. Now, read that as at all, over the last few years. And so when I looked at those two things, I decided to, one, devise and code a solution to a problem that has been eluding me for a number of years, and then terrify myself by presenting it in front of my peers. And so today, I bring you DNSplice. But to begin at the beginning, as Phil said, my name is Shelley Giesbrecht. I am a managing lead of the Cisco Security Incident Response Services team, and I have a confession. I love DNS. Back when I gave my first talk at the DFIR Summit, I was working for an oil and gas company. And I was a security operations analyst, an incident responder, and my boss had just bought us our first SIM. And we had done an exhaustive RFP. We'd asked all the leading SIM vendors a litany of questions. And the most important one to me was, do you parse Microsoft DNS logs? And to a vendor, they said, we do. And guess what? They all lied. Yeah. Okay, lied is a strong word, admittedly. But what they meant was, we parse the DNS Server Service Log, which has events, great gems like the DNS Server Service has started. And the DNS Server Service has stopped. I guess I should have been more specific. So I spent the next 2 to 3 years chasing my SIM vendor, saying what I really wanted was the request and response data from the Microsoft DNS debug log. Crickets for 2 years, nothing. So I eventually wrote my own parser. That is all in history. However, that actually wasn't addressed by that SIM vendor until 2015, which is a long time for an artifact. And there's been a lot of talk about new artifacts today, but this is an old school artifact that I think has a lot of value, and I think we shouldn't ignore because we still have them all sitting out there somewhere. So why DNS? Well, I don't know if anybody else spent 7 minutes on their first slide, but I did. Why DNS? Because DNS is an integral part, from a protocol perspective, of the communication that goes on our internal networks and on the great adventure we call the internet every day. Every time a host on our networks makes a call for a named service or a named resource, there's a DNS request that goes along with that. So that's a lot of data. And if we're not looking at request and response queries, then we're really missing out on a huge piece of that super timeline that creates the fabric of our investigations. So all right, let's have a look and let's go see if we can get some DNS data. There's a small problem. DNS logging from Microsoft has been for a long time reasonably problematic. For one, it is not and has never been on by default. So in the realm of logging in the world, DNS debug logging is, for lack of a better term, and I apologize to my good friend Brian Moran, the red-headed stepchild of the logging world. If you work at an organization that has a SIM platform, good for you. You get it to be ingested, parsed, and spit out and added to your data. But for a lot of us, particularly the traveling consultants, when I go out to see a client all the time, frequently those clients have very little in the way of logging, if at all. If they're doing DNS logging, it's probably not going anywhere, and they may not have a way to parse that data. And that's where the idea for DNSplice started. So let's talk a little bit about DNS logging. As I said, in Microsoft DNS, it is not and has never been on by default. Additionally, when we go way back to Windows 2003, and I'm not going to ask for hands, but I know that there is someone in this room that at a branch office or maybe the main office has a Windows 2003 DNS server still running. Don't lie to me because I've been to some of your offices. Okay, maybe not you guys, but I've been to some offices. And the only way to see request and response queries from Microsoft 2003 DNS Server Service was by turning on the Microsoft DNS debug log. Now, if we ask Microsoft about turning it on, what are they going to tell us? It's a debug log. Unless you're debugging, don't turn it on. It's a performance hit. But how else are we going to get that data? That's it. So we have the choice of either turning it on and maybe taking a performance hit and missing all of that data altogether. In my experience, as long as you have a well-built DNS server, the performance hit really isn't that much. So to turn this on, we're going to go into the DNS console, the DNS Management Console, right-click on the DNS server, go into the properties on the debugging tab, click the box for log packets. You can choose a few different options depending on what you want to do, but most of them are on by default. You want to choose a file path and a name, and the size. How big do you want it to get? These do get fairly large very quickly if you have a DNS server that's very busy, so you may want to move those off somewhere so that you don't overwrite that very precious data. So let's have a little look and see what they've given us in this file. Oh, well, that's all right. They've given us a few fields that they're describing. There's a time and date, and right down at the bottom there, you'll see something called question name, which probably may belong to the URL that we're requesting. So let's have a look at that URL and see. And good God, what in the name of all that is holy is that? That, my friends, is what Microsoft considers a URL query. The parentheses represent, and the number in the parentheses represent the number of characters that come after that with a 0 record on the end, indicating the end of the line. That's great, but it's kind of ugly, isn't it? Additionally, there's some weird things about this log as well. If it's a response, they mark it with an R. If it's a query, it's blank. So they have a flag or an opcode for a standard query, which is a Q. So if it's a response to a standard query, you get an RQ. And if it's a query of a standard query, then you get a blank Q. Which means that the spacing and the formatting of this log are off and not all that easy to pull into, say, the OG of our forensic toolset, Excel, and look at very easily. I will tell you that this horror show continued until Windows 2008 R2. They made a small date format change, but this sort of logging continued. It just didn't seem like it was important. But somewhere between 2008 and 2012, Microsoft may possibly have decided that DNS debug log, request and response logging was actually something that could be possibly interesting. Now, you notice me saying could be and possibly, because it's still not on by default. And they made it an event trace log. I'm not going to say they screwed up a little bit because Nicole loves them so much, but they're not that easy to deal with. So there's two types of logs that were created for Windows 2012. The first one is a DNS audit log. The DNS audit log has events like zone transfer records, which is great. And it's in the format of a very lovely EVTX event log format. Sits in the event viewer, very nice to look at. You can set it out to your seams very easily. The other one is the DNS analytical log, and it's in the event trace log format. If we want to turn this on, we're going to go into the event viewer, navigate to application and service logs, Microsoft, Windows, and DNS server. You're going to right-click there, select view, and check show analytic and debug logs. Because yes, they still consider it a debug log. It's not crucial data, it's just debug. And you're still not done then. Still in the event viewer, once you've turned this on, you see those two new logs appear, audit and analytical. You need to right-click on the analytical, select properties, and you need to check the radio button at the bottom there that says do not overwrite events, clear manually, to make sure that they don't overwrite it for you. And then and only then, you can enable the log. Oh yeah, you have to click OK. That is very important. Quickly, right-click there, radio button at the bottom, check, and away you go. Now, as I said, these are in ETL format. So to get these out, whereas compared to the DNS debug logs in 2003 and 2008, all I had to do, and I did it in a very unforensic way for this particular realm of tests, I just copied it off, and it was fine. These guys are a little bit different because they aren't read in quote-unquote normal tools. So I did a lot of Googling, and I found that a tool called Tracelog, which exists in the Windows Developer Kit. If you install the Windows Developer Kit, you can use Tracelog to export these to CSV. Well, I installed Windows Developer Kit, which is a large download for one tool, on both my 2012 and 2016 DNS servers. And I don't know what I was doing. I might be doing it wrong, but it wasn't really working for me. So I did a little bit more research, and I found that there's actually an executable right in the System32 directory called tracereport, which pretty much does the same thing. Using the command on the screen there, which I am not going to say out loud, you can export those very easily to CSV. So I did all of this research. It took me a while to figure this out. And then I discovered really recently, before I could update my slides, and when I say recently, I mean in the last week, that if you're in the event viewer, you can actually save all these events out as a CSV file. I'm actually going to write a little bit of a blog post on it because it's not as simple as that. But you can actually do this a little bit easier than what I did. That said, if you're going to automate the process and actually grab those logs out on a regular basis, this might be the way you want to go because this will be probably easier to script. And these look like this. A lot of extraneous columns that I've hidden for you. But you get an event description, event IDs, fantastic. The clock time is in Microsoft Epoch. You get the DNS server that was the interface, as well as the client IP, and either the response or the request URL. As we're going through this, you may notice some of the names of my hosts. My entire domain and all of the hosts are from characters from the Black Panther universe. So now I've got these logs, and I had to decide what I wanted to do with them. So I wanted to read them into memory and be able to then parse them and put them into a format that I could do more with. And then I wanted to output it to some sort of file. I chose CSV because for me that was the easiest thing to go for. But I wanted to add a little bit more value to this tool, hopefully. So I created some stats. Initially, they're fairly small ones, some outliers. I'm going to talk about those in a minute. And we print those to the screen when you run the tool. Additionally, I wanted to be able to look up the domains that I was pulling out and figure out if there was something that I needed to be concerned about around them. So I wanted to include the ability to use some of online tools that we have available to us, like VirusTotal, to do a domain report lookup. So I created an API lookup for VirusTotal, and I work for Cisco, so I use Cisco Threat Grid because I have an API key. I was going to include a lookup for our Whois as well, but with the whole GDPR thing, I decided to wait till version 2. I did not bring a policy sign up for all of you. That was very clever, by the way. All right, so the requirements for this is pretty easy. You need Python. It is written in 2.7 right now. My apologies to the folks, to the fans of 3.0. And you need the request module from Python. And Captain Obvious, you also need some DNS logs. As Matt Sire said in his presentation, it is always a good idea to start by doing the -H and figuring out what you need to do when you're running the code. There are 3 command arguments for DNSplice. The first one is required, and that is -I, because they need to know where your DNS file is that you're actually ingesting into the tool. The second 2 are optional. First one is the virus total API key, -V, and the second one is your threat grade API key, -T. All right, basic parsing, pretty easy. I wanted to make this as simple as possible, frankly. So the command is, unless you've passed your Python, the script name dns_v1.py, -I, and your file name. It opens the file. It figures out what version of Windows that you're using based on what is in the lines of the file, spits it out, cleans it up, and then formats the values and gives you 4 columns: timestamp, client IP, the full URL requested, and the base domain. Really simple. I wanted to make sure that this didn't have a lot of extraneous stuff in it. It's really just what you need. And this is kind of what it ended up looking like. No live demo for me. And I typed very slowly. So entering in the command line with the path to your file. And when you hit enter, it starts spitting out a bunch of stuff to the screen. We scroll up a little bit. It'll tell you that you are parsing your ugly DNS logs. Hooray! And it also is going to give you those stats right away. The output file is called output.csv. It is outputted and saved to the directory that you run the script from. And it includes, as I said, 4 columns: the time and date stamp, the client IP that's requesting, the URL that was requested, and the base domain. The statistics are really about improving my ability to code and taking the steps one step farther. And I wanted to include some things that I think that I would look at if I was looking at this data and trying to figure out whether there were some outliers that I needed to know about. So the first one is the client with the most requests. Because sometimes we're looking for an operational problem, like maybe a client is causing an issue on our networks, or maybe we're looking for something that's, has a high amount of queries that's maybe doing something malicious. The second one was, what are our top 10 requested domains? What's getting requested most, and do we have something that's maybe suspicious that we need to look at? And the last one was the top 10 least requested domains, because let's face it, those outliers, those small ones, are maybe the ones that we don't see and that are maybe causing the most problem. And those stats automatically appear on the screen as soon as you run the basic command. And they kind of end up looking like this. Top 10 requesting client IPs gives you the IP and the number of times that they have requested a domain. The top 10 requested domains and the top least requested domains, again, with the domain name and the number of times that they were requested. This was this next piece, and it was important to me to, one, again, it stretched my, hopefully, coding abilities, but also, I always want to know, what am I looking at? Not only, so I've got this list of domains, but let's do something interesting with it. So we added the API Domain Lookup. So you run your command, and I, on purpose, did not include the typing in the domain, or pardon me, in the command, because I wanted to make sure that I didn't forget to remove my own API keys from any of the slides. Once it's run, it starts at the bottom there. It'll run each domain as it goes, and when that domain is complete, you get it complete on the screen, and it moves to the next one. Again, really easy to run. Full command with the -I and then -V with your API key. What it's doing is using the list of domains that was created during the output.parsing. And because with the public API key, virus total lookups are limited to 4 per minute, I actually limited it to 3 per minute. It seemed to work a little better, and I wanted to make sure that when you were using the tool that you didn't outstrip your, didn't get banned for the day because you used too many in a particular minute. And it parses out to a CSV file called vt_output.csv. And right now, in this current version, it parses out into 2 columns, the domain and a very large blob of JSON goodness from virus total. And it kind of looks like this. Your 2 columns with your domain and a very large JSON blob. If you don't use the API key, then you just get this written to the screen to say that you didn't use your API key. This is going to look very familiar to the last few slides. The thread grid lookup is, again, just simply another way to add functionality. In the future, I'm very interested in adding other API keys. Please let me know if it's something you'd like me to add. Very, very similar functionality. Once you've typed your API key in with the command, it will run at the bottom of the screen. And when a domain is finished, it marks it complete and moves to the next one. Very same command path using -T and your API key. Now, threat grid, at least for me, is limited to a lookup of 50 domain or 50 searches per day, domains or otherwise. So I wanted to make sure that we were narrowing down, not just using that full list, because maybe those aren't the ones we want to look at. So I limited it to the top 10 and the top least requested domains. You can play with that number in the code. You could actually go up to, obviously, 25 per on either side, or depending on where you wanted those numbers to lie, and figure out where the best balance for you is. Parses out again to another file, tg_output.csv. And ends up looking very similarly like this. And if you don't use the threat grid key, then obviously you get this printed to the screen as well. This is a big slide for me, because there's a lot of things that I discovered along the way that I really wanted to do with this. The first thing is to clean it up. So this was a really first coding project for me, and I've been, over the last day and a half, watching some amazing things being introduced. Following Matt Sayer is a little intimidating, frankly. After Yogesh's presentation on Mac app yesterday, I was thinking to myself, oh my goodness. But it's something to aspire to for me, and that's kind of where I'm taking this. They had next step slides. This is mine. I want to clean up my code. My next steps for me is to learn how to create functions, exception handling, and those other niceties of code that make it more of an application as opposed to a script. I also want to port it to Python 3. It's going to allow me a little bit more functionality with some of the new modules that are coming out, and I think obviously give it a little bit more of a future path with the end of life for Python 2.7 coming up. I'd like to create a config file, because if you're going to be using API keys and maybe user-defined directories and files, you want to be able to put those into a config file and not have to type them in all the time. And I'd like to include multi-file upload, because we want to make our data set bigger if we can, and be able to use, if we're constantly pulling in different files, have that bigger data set to look at from all of our DNS servers. This came from my friend Tom Yarish when he was looking at the tool. It makes a lot of sense. Folks want to be able to name their own files, put them where they want to, and maybe output them in a format that isn't CSV. So we're looking at some other options like JSON and XML, but you folks can let me know if there's something that would be interesting for you to have. And with the upgrade to Python 3, I'll be able to use the statistics module and maybe some other stuff out there to create a little bit more flexibility with regards to those statistics and make those a little bit more useful again. I also noticed when I was doing this that as I was pulling out, a lot of the popular domains like google.com, microsoft.com, nerdiosity.com, very popular, come up a lot, right? So sometimes we might want to reduce that noise volume and exclude those from our searches. We may also want to include the internal domains that are coming up as well, again, to make sure that we're only getting maybe that external traffic if that's what we're looking at. And I want to make use of the JSON data that's coming back from the API calls, figuring out what is really important in those blobs that are coming back, and maybe formatting into some sort of report that a user might be able to run. And I'd also like to create some sort of back end for this, a storage vehicle, because let's face it, if you're pulling in all of this data all the time, you want to be able to maybe have some specialized queries with regards to either a specific time or different types of domains or otherwise. So I want to make sure that I can put that into somewhere that you can actually then go in and search. And maybe, just maybe, a GUI. I mean, we love the command line. Say it with me, we all love the command line. But sometimes ease of use or being able to include data visualizations or otherwise, I think that would be really interesting. And definitely, again, from a coding perspective, it's going to help me stretch a little bit and learn a little bit more. So I want to say thank you so much for coming on this journey with me today. This has been a little bit of, like I said, a terrifying experience. I have done some things that I never thought I was going to do. One, learn to code a little bit better. Two, figure out how to deal with those ugly DNS logs that have been plaguing me for a number of years. And three, and probably most important, is giving back to a DFIR community that has given me a lot. So thanks to Rob and Phil and Jennifer Santiago and the SANS team for putting together such an amazing conference over the last 2 days. I'm last, so I get to say sort of thank you on behalf of everybody. DNSplice is available on GitHub now. Please give it a download, give it a try, if only because I would really love everybody's feedback. I want to continue this journey, and I would really appreciate you continuing it on with me. So thank you very much, and enjoy the forensic forecast.